Thank you, Nina Enrique. Good evening, everyone. I'm Alma Angeles for NET25 World News. On tonight's headlines. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer says European leaders have agreed to draw up a Ukraine peace plan to present to the United States. The plan is a vital step to offer security guarantees. France and Britain are proposing a one-month truce in the war between Russia and Ukraine, focusing on stopping attacks on air, sea, and energy infrastructure. Firefly Aerospace succeeded in its first attempt to land on the moon with its uncrewed Blue Ghost spacecraft as a handful of private firms compete to reach the front lines of a global moon race. And the news starts now. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer says European leaders have agreed to draw up a Ukraine peace plan to present to the United States. The plan is a vital step to offer security guarantees that Kiev says are essential to deter Russia. Now, Starmer met with European leaders at a summit in London on Sunday, just 2 days after the spat in the Oval Office between U.S. President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Thomas I. Likeness for more.
The London summit is a strong show of support for Zelensky. European leaders promised to do more to help his country. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer says the peace plan will have a number of elements.
First, we will keep the military aid flowing and keep increasing the economic pressure on Russia to strengthen Ukraine now. Second, we agreed that any lasting peace must ensure Ukraine's sovereignty and security, and Ukraine must be at the table. Third, in the event of a peace deal, we will keep boosting Ukraine's own defensive capabilities to deter any future invasion. Fourth, we will go further to develop a coalition of the willing to defend a deal in Ukraine and to guarantee the peace.
Starmer says the UK will provide Ukraine with $2 billion worth of missiles. He says they'll be made in Belfast, which will create jobs in the country's defense sector. Referring to the dust-up last Friday between Zelensky and Trump, Starmer says he does not accept that the US is an unreliable ally. A common theme among the leaders at the summit is that Europe has to beef up its military resources. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says, quite simply, the continent has to rearm itself.
We really have to step up massive the defense expenditure. And for that we need a clear, big plan from the European Union for the member states and, of course, for common European domains. Like, for example, advanced air shields, we need a common European approach, but also the member states need more fiscal space to do a surge in defense.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz says Ukraine's sovereignty must be protected. He says Ukraine will never dance to Russia's tune, and he says Russia remains a threat to the world.
And it is key that we all are understanding that it is our common task to support Ukraine, because it's a threat to the security architecture, not just of Europe, but also the world, that Russia invaded its neighbor country just for conquering part of the territory or all the territory. We cannot accept this, and we cannot accept that borders will be changed by force.
The peace plan will be developed by the UK and France and possibly one or two other countries. Zelensky says he will not accept any agreement that gives Ukrainian land to Russia. Outside the venue of the summit, people protested in support of Ukraine. Demonstrators held Ukrainian flags and signs with messages of support for Ukraine and against Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Thomas I. Likeness, NET25 World News.
France and Britain are proposing a one-month truce in the war between Russia and Ukraine, focusing on stopping attacks on air, sea, and energy infrastructure. However, ground fighting wouldn't be included in the plan. French President Emmanuel Macron explained. He added that European ground troops would only be deployed in a second phase after a peace deal is reached.
This truce in the air, on the seas and on energy infrastructures will attest to the good faith of Russian President Vladimir Putin when he commits to this truce. And that is when the real negotiations for peace will begin. Because we want peace, but we want a solid peace, a lasting peace, a peace that puts a definitive end to what has been happening, of course, in the east of the continent for 15 years.
The proposal comes just days after a tense Oval Office meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and U.S. President Donald Trump. While tensions remain high, European leaders are pushing for diplomacy to end the conflict.
I believe that there is desire on both sides, because of a shared awareness that it is in the interest of Ukraine, the interest of the Europeans and the interest of the Americans to ensure that Russian President Vladimir Putin's imperialist ambitions are put to a halt.
The Kremlin, which has rejected the idea of Western troops being deployed to Ukraine, said the Oval Office clash between Trump and Zelensky showed how difficult it would be to reach a settlement on the conflict in Ukraine.
The president took note of what happened once again. In fact, the entire Russian side was once again shown that President Putin was right when he said that the Russian side was ready for negotiations, but these good intentions are bogged down by the unwillingness of the Kiev regime to maintain this dynamic. This is what we fully saw in Washington.
Top Republicans aligned with President Donald Trump are ramping up pressure on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to shift his stance on the war with Russia or step aside. And this follows a tense White House meeting last week. Take a look. Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, told CNN that the administration doubts Zelensky is ready to negotiate an end to the war. Waltz emphasized Trump's goal of achieving permanent peace, which could involve Ukraine making territorial concessions in exchange for European-led security guarantees. When asked if Trump wants Zelensky to resign, Waltz said, "We need a leader who can work with us and eventually negotiate with Russia." U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham and House Speaker Mike Johnson echoed similar concerns about Zelensky's leadership.
He either needs to resign and send somebody over that we can do business with, or he needs to change.
That President Zelensky will come to his senses, come back to President Trump, express gratitude as he should, apologize for his behavior there, and accept this mineral rights deal, because that is the best way for us to get to a point of peace over there in that region, and it's in the interest of both countries.
Meanwhile, Zelensky defended his position during the White House meeting, calling Russian President Vladimir Putin a killer and a terrorist who hasn't honored past ceasefire agreements.
In 2019, I signed with him the deal. I signed with him, Macron and Merkel, we signed ceasefire. Ceasefire. All of them told me that he will never go. We signed him with gas contract. Yes, but after that, he broken this ceasefire. He killed our people and he didn't exchange prisoners. We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What do you mean?
I'm talking about the kind of diplomacy that's going to end the destruction of your country.
Yes, but if you
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what?
We are trying to end a war. You cannot end a war unless both sides come to the table, starting with the Russians. And that is the point the president has made. And we have to do whatever we can to try to bring them to the table to see if it's even possible. I'm not promising you it's possible. I'm not telling you it's 90% likely. I'm saying it's 0% likely if we don't get them to a negotiating table. And the sooner everyone grows up around here and figures out that this is a bad war that's heading in a bad direction with death and destruction and all kinds of dangers surrounding it that could spiral into a broader conflict, the sooner people grow up and realize that, I think the more progress we're going to be able to make.
The debate highlights growing divisions over how to resolve the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, with questions about whether Zelensky remains the right leader for the job. Now, there are questions over U.S. support for Ukraine after a discussion between the leaders of the two nations in the Oval Office degenerated into a shouting match. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance piled on Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky, accusing him of disrespect. Zelensky was then booted out of the White House. In Washington, Arlene Ocampo reports.
The ill-fated meeting has driven relations with Kyiv's most important wartime ally to a new low. European leaders have largely leapt to President Volodymyr Zelensky's defense.
We spoke about this in detail.
The meeting Friday went off the rails when Vance suggested the need for diplomacy to resolve the Russia-Ukraine war. Zelensky countered that Putin cannot be trusted and noted Vance had never visited Ukraine. Zelensky also challenged Trump over his softer approach to Putin, urging the U.S. president to make no compromises with what he calls a killer. That led to exchanges like this.
You have to be thankful. You don't have the cards. You're buried there. Your people are dying. You're running low on soldiers. Listen, you're running low on soldiers. It would be a damn good thing. And then you tell us, I don't want a ceasefire. I don't want a ceasefire.
Later, Trump left the White House for a weekend of golf in Florida. Before departing, he said Zelensky doesn't appear interested in peace.
He's got to say, I want to make peace. He doesn't have to stand there and say about Putin this, Putin that, all negative things. He's got to say, I want to make peace. I don't want to fight a war any longer. His people are dying. He doesn't have the cards, just so you understand it, okay? I can tell you.
The former Assistant Deputy Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO says the clash shows how bad the American leadership looked to the world. But John Townsend says Trump wanted to be in the spotlight.
But you don't have the cards. But once we sign that deal, you're in a much better position. But you're not acting at all thankful. And that's not a nice thing. I'll be honest, that's not a nice thing. All right, I think we've seen enough. What do you think? Huh? This is going to be great television, I will say that. All right. We'll see what we can do about putting it together.
At the very end, I understand Trump said something like, this is going to make great TV. And he also said that he was glad this was happening in front of the cameras so that the American people could see what's going on or something like that. And so obviously he was glad that he was being filmed, and he took full advantage of that by being a tough guy.
More worrisome is, will the bickering lead to the U.S. withdrawing its support for Ukraine? Ukrainian political analyst Yevhen Hlibavitsky says Ukraine has to be ready to rely more on its own resources.
And it also means that there is a dangerous link between revisionists in Moscow and revisionists in Washington, D.C. And unwillingness to side with Ukraine. It has been expressed quite loudly.
Hlibavitsky adds the breakdown in U.S.-Ukraine relations has European leaders doing some thinking about what it means for them.
What we see is that there is the difference in stance that is probably too big to cover. And because that difference is there, this is an alarm going off for the Europeans to actually side with Ukraine and to rethink the European Union not only in terms of prosperity, but also in terms of security.
On Saturday, dozens of protesters demonstrated outside of the White House condemning Trump's behavior towards Zelensky. Many say they are disappointed by the president's performance.
I'm so incredibly impressed with Zelensky. He handled that situation so well in the Oval Office. But what Trump did was a disgrace to the United States, to the world.
The treatment that President Zelensky received yesterday, and I don't support that.
And while world opinion largely agrees with these sentiments, it likely won't change Trump's mind. He has clearly come down on Russia's side in this war and views Ukraine only for what it may provide the United States with. And that leaves Ukraine and the EU with some big worries and a lot of sleepless nights. Arlene Ocampo, Washington, D.C. for NET25 World News.
Now to recall, Russian President Vladimir Putin has issued a warning to Western elites against undermining efforts to improve relations between Russia and the United States. Addressing Russia's FSB security service, the successor to the Soviet era, KGB, and an agency he once led. President Putin said he was pleased with the way an attempted reboot in ties between Moscow and Washington was progressing, even though it was early days.
First contacts with the new U.S. administration give certain hopes. There is mutual determination to work restoration of relations between two countries.
And then he went on to hail the fact that Russia's current partners were demonstrating what he called pragmatism and realism.
It is important that our current partners demonstrate pragmatism and realistic view on things. They reject many stereotypes, so-called rules and messianic ideological cliches of their predecessors, who in fact led to international relationship crisis.
But Putin said it was clear that not all countries were in favor of the idea of warmer ties between the world's two biggest nuclear powers.
We understand that not everybody welcomes restoration of Russia-US contacts. Some Western elites keep seeking instability in the world, and these forces will try to disrupt or undermine dialogue which has begun. You and I can see it.
Now, with 90% of U.S. foreign aid halted, the United Nations is expressing concern over how disastrously this will impact the world's most vulnerable. Worried about this more than likely result, aid groups are seeking help from the U.S. Supreme Court. Percival Parlare has that story.
United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres says he's deeply concerned about the severe cuts to American foreign aid. And foreign aid groups have gone to the U.S. Supreme Court asking it to force President Donald Trump's administration to pay them for work they have already done.
The consequences will be especially devastating for vulnerable people around the world.
The warning comes from United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres. His comments came at the end of the week as fired U.S. Agency for International Development Workers cleared out their desks. Trump says he is cutting more than 90% of the agency's aid contracts, something Guterres says will work against the U.S.
With these cuts, we will make the world less healthy, less safe, and less prosperous. The reduction of America's humanitarian role and influence will run counter to American interests globally.
Some of the programs that will be cut include help for those fleeing the civil war in Sudan. Funding has also stopped for health programs to prevent the spread of tuberculosis, malaria, and other diseases. Also affected is the U.S. Office on Drugs and Crime. It will be forced to stop many of its counter-narcotics programs, including one fighting the fentanyl crisis Trump claims he's so concerned about. Guterres holds out hope that Trump might have a change of heart.
I can only hope that these decisions can be reversed based on more careful reviews, and the same applies to other countries that have recently announced reductions in humanitarian and development aid.
Fired workers leaving U.S. aid headquarters in Washington, some with tears in their eyes, found themselves greeted by a crowd of people who showed their support with cheers and applause. But it didn't make it any easier for these workers to swallow the bitter pill of seeing the agency decimated.
You know, again, less than 1% of our budget. Like, that's not a saving. And this work is literally life and death for some people.
You know, there would have been a very clear and particular way to reform the foreign assistance sector in this country, to reform USAID. And frankly, a lot of people sort of wanted to see that. This could have been done in a much more genuine and relevant way, and it really wasn't.
I worry about the people that have gone this many days without food, without medicine, without the humanitarian assistance that we promised them.
The Office of the Inspector General has done numerous audits and has found no fraud, no waste. What Elon Musk thinks is that he has found things he disagrees with.
And while the agency winds down, contractors and recipients of grants are asking the Supreme Court to make sure they get their money. About $2 billion in foreign aid payments remain in jeopardy. Also in jeopardy, the lives of tens of millions of people who have relied on the generosity of the United States for life-saving food and medical aid. Percival Parlade, Washington, D.C. for NET25 World News.
The 44th iteration of the Cobra Gold military exercise kicked off in Thailand this week, bringing together over 8,000 personnel from 30 nations. The 44th iteration of the Cobra Gold military exercises kicked off in Thailand this week, bringing together over 8,000 personnel from 30 nations. The annual event, co-hosted by Thailand and the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, is one of the largest multinational military exercises in Southeast Asia. This year's key participating nations include Thailand, the U.S., Singapore, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, and Malaysia. China and India are participating in a humanitarian assistance program, while Australia is involved in the command and control segment.
From the U.S. perspective, we're learning different techniques and tactics and procedures on how to work not only amphibious but also in some of the unique environments that are offered here in Thailand, specifically the jungle. Obviously the littoral region with the great beaches and the ocean. And we also are learning different techniques on how to communicate, how to survive in the jungle, how to interoperate with regards to our weapon systems and our tactics, and basically just making ourselves better partners for our allies here with the Royal Thai Marine Corps, as well as our other partners from the Republic of Korea and the Singapore Armed Forces. Up in Karat last week, we were working on non-combatant evacuation operations, taking lessons learned from the Thai Armed Forces that recently did non-combatant evacuations in Sudan and in Israel and Gaza. So those recent experiences from the Thai Marine Corps, they've imparted and shared that knowledge with us so that we can operate better together if some sort of crisis or contingency may emerge in this region.
The USS Carl Vinson, a U.S. aircraft carrier, arrived in Busan, South Korea on Sunday in what the South Korean Navy is calling a show of force against North Korea. Accompanied by the USS Princeton and the USS Sterett, this marks the first time a U.S. aircraft carrier has docked in South Korea since June. The visit underscores the ironclad commitment of the U.S. to its alliance with South Korea. Rear Admiral Michael S. Wasji, commander of the Carrier Strike Group 1, emphasized the importance of joint training.
Clearly, our presence here in Busan shows the strong alliance between the Republic of Korea and the United States, and our opportunity to train and operate together with our allies, as we have done for the last 72 years. And we will certainly look forward to continuing to do that.
A devastating fire in Malaysia's Sabah state has left over 600 villagers without homes. The blaze tore through Kampung Sempaka early this morning, destroying about 80 houses. Firefighters were able to get the flames under control, and thankfully no one was hurt. However, 139 families are now displaced, with most taking shelter at a local community hall. The Sabah government is providing emergency cash assistance to help those affected. Sadly, this wasn't the only fire in Sabah. 2 separate fires have caused widespread damage. Officials are still investigating the cause of these fires. Though fire is not a natural occurrence in Borneo's climate, the incident has sparked concern, with land clearing activities and climate change mentioned as contributing factors. The Sabah government is being urged to reinforce measures to prevent future incidents. Meanwhile, a wildfire continued to spread on Monday in northeastern Japan, prompting the local government to expand evacuation orders for nearly 4,600 people. Aerial footage shot by Japan's Self-Defense Force at 2100 GMT shows strong flames burning multiple houses and trees at a small coastal town near Ofunato City in Iwate Prefecture. About 2,100 hectares of land have been burnt, and 4,596 people were ordered to evacuate, according to public broadcaster NHK. The wildfire broke out around 0440 GMT last February 26. but local police and fire department have been struggling to contain it since then. So far, only one reported death, according to the local authority. And the news continues here on NET25. We'll be right back. Singapore authorities are investigating a potential fraud case involving servers that may contain advanced NVIDIA chips subject to U.S. export restrictions. Take a look. The servers supplied by U.S. companies like Dell and Supermicro were reportedly destined for Malaysia.
Okay, last week on the 26th of February, raids were conducted by our law enforcement agencies. 3 persons were arrested and they've been charged for suspected fraud. Investigations are going on. Essentially, the case relates to servers with chips embedded in them coming into Singapore, and then from Singapore they went to Malaysia.
But authorities suspect they may have been intended for another unknown final destination.
This is how US server suppliers, I think Dell and Supermicron in this case, they supplied to Singapore-based companies, and from Singapore it went to Malaysia. The question is whether Malaysia was a final destination or from Malaysia it went to somewhere else. And therefore we have asked both the US and Malaysia for more information so as to assist in our investigations. We received an anonymous tip-off. It was not a tip-off or information from any country or sovereign entity, but we took the tip-off seriously.
Meanwhile, tragedy struck the German city of Mannheim today as a car rammed into a crowd of carnival celebrators, killing 1 person and injuring several others. Police have detained the driver and are investigating. Authorities are urging people to avoid the city center. The incident occurred as crowds gathered for carnival parades, raising security concerns already heightened after recent attacks in Germany. Police were on high alert for potential threats connected to the Islamic State group. Firefly Aerospace succeeded in its first attempt to land on the moon with its uncrewed Blue Ghost spacecraft as a handful of private firms compete to reach the front lines of a global moon race.
Y'all stuck to landing. We're on the moon.
Firefly Aerospace succeeded in its first attempt to land on the moon. It landed its uncrewed Blue Ghost spacecraft on Sunday to kick off a 2-week research mission. The craft is the size of a company car and carried 10 scientific payloads. Firefly became the second private firm to score a moon landing, though it declared itself the first company to make a fully successful soft landing. Texas-based Intuitive Machines made a lopsided touchdown last year with its Odysseus lander. 5 nations have made successful soft landings in the past. The US and China are both rushing to put their astronauts on the moon later this decade. Each has courted allies and given their private sectors a key role in spacecraft development. The US plans on sending its astronauts back to the moon in a series of crewed missions starting in 2 years. China is also making quick progress. It plans to land astronauts on the moon's surface by 2030.
And with that, we end tonight's broadcast. For everyone here on NET25, I'm Alma Angeles. Thank you for joining us. Good night.